He walked into the cafe, expecting a quiet morning coffee, but the sight of his red MAGA hat immediately drew unwanted attention. Within minutes, he was being kicked out, accused of threats and provoking trouble, without anyone bothering to find out who he really was. But when his true status was revealed, the whole atmosphere shifted. How would he respond to the humiliation? What happens when the law meets bias? Max, the chief of police in a small but bustling city, had decided to take a break from his demanding job and visit a local cafe. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had a certain charm that made it popular among the city's younger crowd. Today, Max wore his MAGA hat, a symbol of his political beliefs. As he stepped into the cafe, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The place, known for its progressive clientele, seemed to freeze for a moment. Max was used to the stares, the whispers, the judgment. He had long since learned to tune it all out, but today felt different. As he walked in, several patrons exchanged glances, some of them shooting him a look of barely contained disdain. Max kept his head high, his eyes fixed on the counter where he intended to order his coffee. The first sign of trouble came quickly. Arthur, a young wiry waiter with an obvious look of distaste on his face, approached. He glanced at Max's hat, then at him, before visibly recoiling. "Excuse me, sir," Arthur said, his tone clipped. "You might want to leave. This cafe's for normal people, not people like you." Max, unfazed, looked at the waiter. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, silently, waiting for the inevitable next move. Arthur, not receiving the immediate confrontation he seemed to want, turned and muttered to the other staff. Max could hear the low murmurs behind him, clearly speaking about his MAGA hat, making disparaging remarks about people like him. He could feel the tension building in the room, but he wasn't backing down. Within minutes, Arthur, seemingly unable to handle the situation on his own, waved over the cafe manager. Greg, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit that looked too tight for him. Greg approached with the air of someone who believed his opinion carried weight. He stood in front of Max, looking him up and down. His gaze lingered on the MAGA hat for a moment too long. Before he spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "We can't serve people like you here," Greg said coldly. "This is a place for people who understand what's right, not for people with those kinds of symbols." Max stared at Greg for a moment, weighing his options. He was the chief of police, someone who could easily make Greg's life difficult if he chose to. But he wasn't here for a fight. Not today. Instead, Max simply nodded and turned toward the exit. He wasn't going to engage with ignorance. Not today. As Max made his way to the door, he couldn't help but notice a young man in his early 20s, sitting at the table near the entrance. The guy was holding his phone in one hand, his eyes trained on Max. As Max passed by, the young man suddenly jumped to his feet. "This guy's a Republican!" the young man shouted across the cafe. "Better call the cops, he might be dangerous." Max stopped for a moment, feeling a familiar wave of frustration. He didn't want to escalate this. He wasn't looking for trouble. But the young man wasn't stopping. He was already on his phone, his voice growing louder as he spoke into the receiver. "There's a man in here with MAGA symbols on his hat. He's threatening us. You need to send someone over right away." Max stood there, arms crossed, trying to keep his cool as the cafe's patrons began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some were staring, others pretending not to notice. The tension in the room was palpable, and Max knew exactly what was happening. He was being targeted. But there was something else happening too. This wasn't just about his hat. This was about political prejudice, and he was the target. Max didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, calm and collected, allowing the young man to finish his call. The police were on their way. Please. Max stepped out of the cafe, his thoughts heavy with the absurdity of the situation. As soon as he reached the sidewalk, he heard rapid footsteps behind him. It was the same young man who had made the phone call. The man, still holding his phone in one hand, quickly caught up to Max and blocked his path. His face was twisted with frustration. "You seriously think anyone's going to take you seriously with that hat on?" The man spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You better get out of here while you still can." Max didn't respond. He simply kept his eyes forward, taking slow steps toward the sidewalk. But the man wasn't done. He wasn't going to let this go so easily. "I've already called the cops," the man continued, his tone rising. "You're going to get fined for this. You have no right to walk around here with that symbol on your head." Max stopped in his tracks. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before answering, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not breaking any laws. I can just wait for the police if you really want me to." The man's face turned an angry shade of red, his posture tense as if expecting Max to back down. But Max didn't. He stood there, staring at the man with a calmness that seemed to frustrate him even more. The young man muttered something under his breath, but Max couldn't make it out. A few moments later, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Max watched as the officers got out, their eyes scanning the area, landing briefly on him before they exchanged glances. Max could feel the weight of their gaze on him, and sure enough, one of them walked toward him, his expression serious. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his eyes dropping to Max's MAGA hat. "You need to leave. Your symbols can be seen as a threat here." Max, feeling a mixture of disbelief and frustration, remained calm. "You really want me to leave just because I'm wearing this hat?" The officer didn't respond immediately, but after a pause, the second officer, a stockier man with a thick jaw, spoke up from behind. "I'm all for peace, but not everyone appreciates that kind of symbol around here." Max couldn't believe what he was hearing. He wasn't causing trouble, he wasn't threatening anyone, and yet they were treating him like a criminal because of his hat. "So what, you want me to leave just because of my hat?" Max asked, raising an eyebrow. "You do realize it's just a piece of clothing, right?" The first officer looked uneasy, but stuck to his stance. "It's not just the hat," he replied. "It's the message. Some people find it provocative." Max shook his head, fighting back the urge to snap back. "It's a hat," he repeated. "It's just a hat. I came here for coffee, not to start a fight." The second officer, still standing behind his partner, added, "Look, we're just trying to keep things peaceful. Some people just don't like that kind of thing. It's better if you leave." Max took a deep breath, not wanting to escalate the situation further, but he wasn't backing down either. "Do you really think this is about the hat?" he asked. "This is about my presence, not my clothing. I'm not the one causing trouble here." The officers didn't seem to respond, just exchanged a look before turning back to Max. Max could tell that neither of them were willing to admit that they were, in fact, treating him unfairly. But then, as if on cue, Arthur, the waiter, came charging out of the cafe, his eyes wide with indignation. He was practically marching toward Max now, an expression of triumph on his face. "Get out of here!" Arthur shouted, pointing directly at Max's MAGA hat. "Take that nonsense somewhere else. We don't need your kind here. We're not going to tolerate that kind of thing." Max turned his gaze toward Arthur, his patience starting to wear thin. He had been insulted, threatened, and treated like an outsider simply because of a hat. But now, with Arthur's smug attitude adding insult to injury, Max decided to finally address him. "Are you sure you want to talk to me like that?" Max asked, his voice still calm but with an underlying edge. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Arthur hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth but quickly shut it, unsure of how to respond. The tension in the air was thick. The officers were looking between Max and Arthur, their expressions shifting as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Max wasn't done yet. "You know," Max said slowly, "I'm the chief of police in this city. I think you should take a step back and reconsider how you're treating me." There was a brief pause, and then Arthur's face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks as realization hit him. The officers exchanged awkward glances, but neither said a word. They were no longer sure of how to proceed. Arthur, still stunned, couldn't bring himself to speak. He simply looked down, his shoulders slumping as the reality of the situation set in. Max didn't wait for an apology. He didn't need one. What he needed was respect, something that had been sorely lacking in that cafe. Turning to the officers, Max nodded. You can go back to your patrol. I'll handle this. As the officers walked away, Max caught sight of the other patrons who had witnessed the exchange. Some were looking away, embarrassed. Others were too afraid to meet his eyes. Max gave them a nod of acknowledgement, but didn't say anything more. Arthur stood there, frozen, unsure of how to handle the situation he had created. Max turned, walked back toward the cafe, and without a word, entered the building, leaving Arthur standing on the sidewalk, his face still pale, the reality of who he had just tried to humiliate finally sinking in. Inside, the cafe had gone silent. People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Max didn't care about the stares anymore. He wasn't here to prove a point. He was here for one thing, his coffee. And no one, no matter how much they hated his beliefs, was going to take that from him. Max stood at the counter, still waiting for his coffee, the tension in the air palpable. The unease of the crowd was tangible, like everyone was holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. But it was Arthur, the arrogant waiter, who broke the silence. He walked up to Max again, his expression defiant, a smirk lingering on his lips. "Are you really going to act like you own the place just because you got your little badge?" Arthur sneered. "That hat doesn't make you special." Max turned slowly, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, there was nothing but cold steel in his eyes. It was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where everything, every insult, every brush-off, every slight, had to be addressed head-on. "Do you want to know who I am?" Max's voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it now, something that no one could ignore. "I'm the chief of police in this city." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his badge, and placed it firmly on the counter in front of Arthur. "And you?" Max paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "Are not just a waiter anymore. You're someone who just broke the law." There was a moment of stunned silence. Arthur's face turned from cocky confidence to something more resembling guilt. The officers, who had been standing quietly by, froze. Their eyes darted between Max, the badge, and Arthur, each one seemingly processing what had just been said. "Wait!" one of the officers said, his voice cracking slightly. "This can't be right. Are you serious?" Max didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, but there was an undeniable fire in his eyes. "Yeah," he said, his tone low and unyielding. "I'm serious. You've just broken the law." He nodded toward the police officers. "Refusing service based on political views? That's not just prejudice. That's a violation of civil rights." The officers exchanged looks, uneasy, uncertain, and the air around them seemed to vibrate with tension. One of them took a step back, clearly not comfortable with what was unfolding. The other, a younger officer who had been the first to approach Max earlier, glanced at his partner, his face a mask of indecision. "Ah," the younger officer muttered, trying to piece together what was happening. I didn't know, sir. I mean, I didn't think this was, like, a big deal." Max didn't let him off the hook. "It's a big deal when people start thinking it's okay to discriminate against someone based on what they believe in. I don't care if you agree with my views, but you cannot treat people like they don't belong in a place just because of what they stand for. You're supposed to uphold the law. You're supposed to protect everyone." The younger officer looked down, visibly uncomfortable. He knew Max was right, but there was no getting around the situation now. The officers were caught in a bind, unsure of how to act without embarrassing themselves further. Meanwhile, the man who had called the police, the one with the phone still gripped tightly in his hand, had been watching the unfolding drama with a growing sense of panic. His face, once full of righteous indignation, was now draining of color. Realizing that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his control, he tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Look, I didn't mean to cause all this," the man stammered, taking a step back from Max. I thought he was a threat. He's wearing that hat and—" Max cut him off, his voice sharp. "Yeah, I know exactly what you thought. You thought I was someone you could easily judge, someone you could make a target because of what I was wearing. But the truth is, you were wrong. And now, I could easily fine you for making a false police report. You've wasted our time. But you know what? I won't. I'll just say this. Leave. Leave and stay out of other people's business next time. Maybe think before you try to ruin someone's day over a damn hat. The man's mouth opened and closed, as though trying to form words that didn't come out. His hands trembled as he shoved the phone back into his pocket, his face a mixture of fear and embarrassment. Arthur, however, wasn't going to back down so easily. He stood there, glaring at Max, trying to maintain his cocky demeanor, but it was clear that the ground was slipping beneath him. Max could see it. The waiter's posture was faltering, his bravado fading. "Yeah, Arthur," Max said, turning his attention back to the waiter. "You can stand there with your little attitude, but let's not forget who's in charge here. The real question is, do you want to keep your job? Because if I were you, I'd start thinking about that." Arthur swallowed hard, but said nothing. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his moral superiority. But now, with the reality of the situation crashing down on him, it was clear that he was out of his depth. Max gave him one last long look. Then, with a subtle nod to the officers, he turned toward the door. "I'm done here," he said. "But next time, Arthur, next time you think you can judge someone based on what they wear, maybe you'll remember who you're really dealing with." The two officers followed Max's lead, stepping back toward the door with a quiet sense of relief. As they left, the awkward silence in the cafe lingered, broken only by the soft clink of cups and the shuffling of feet. The patrons who had been watching the scene unfold exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. No one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. Max walked outside, the cool air hitting his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He didn't need to look back to know that Arthur was probably still standing there, frozen in his own shame. And as Max stood there, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders, he couldn't help but smile to himself. He had won this one, not by force, but by standing firm and showing the world that sometimes the biggest victory is simply doing what's right. For Max, it was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it was one that mattered. And sometimes, that's all it takes to make a difference. Max stood still in the parking lot, the afternoon sun casting long shadows as the police officer shifted nervously beside him. His voice was calm, but the weight of what he was saying lingered in the air, thick with the force of his words. "You know, the way you handled this situation is exactly why people lose trust in the system," Max began, his eyes fixed on the two officers who had just moments ago seemed so confident in their judgment. "You can't just assume someone's guilty based on a hat, on an idea. That's not how we're supposed to do things. That's not how the law works." One of the officers, the younger one who had been hesitant earlier, looked down at his boots, avoiding Max's gaze. His partner, a man in his late 40s, scratched his chin nervously, his hands fidgeting as if they were trying to find some way to escape the conversation. But they both knew what Max was saying was true. They had acted hastily, and now they were caught in a moral bind they didn't know how to resolve. Max continued, his tone unwavering. "I'm going to include this incident in my report. What you did was wrong, and you should both be aware that I won't let this slide. It's not just a matter of personal beliefs. It's a matter of professionalism. And right now, your professionalism is in question." The younger officer swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward his partner. The older officer, who had previously spoken to Max, finally met his gaze with a mix of resignation and regret. I understand, sir," the younger officer stammered, the nervousness in his voice unmistakable. "We didn't mean to, escalate things like this. We just thought—" Max cut him off with a firm but not unkind gesture. "You thought based on assumptions," he said sharply. "You didn't think about the consequences, about what might happen when you act out of bias. You didn't do your job, and that's why we're in this situation now. Not because of the hat, but because you didn't even try to understand the person behind it." Max could see the younger officer struggling to hold himself together. He wasn't a bad person, just someone who had made a mistake under pressure. But the older officer, he wasn't showing any signs of guilt, just embarrassment. Max felt that frustration bubble inside him, but chose to remain calm. He was a professional after all. His job was to lead, to teach, not to berate. He turned his attention to them both and spoke in a more conciliatory tone. "Look, I'm not here to ruin anyone's life, but I am here to hold people accountable. I want you both to take this seriously, to understand that your actions have consequences. I'm giving you the chance to fix this before it gets worse." Max paused for a moment, watching as the officers took in his words. This is where you can make a choice. You can either defend your actions, keep pretending that everything was justified, or you can learn from this. You can improve. I'm suggesting you do the latter. The older officer nodded slowly, though it was clear he was uncomfortable with the idea of being publicly reprimanded. "I get it. We made a mistake. We'll do better." Max didn't smile. He wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for change. "Good," he said. "But don't just say it. Show it. Go back and review your training. Get better at handling situations like this. And most importantly, learn to see people as individuals, not as symbols or labels." As Max spoke, his gaze shifted to Arthur, who had been standing off to the side, nervously watching the exchange. The weight of the situation had finally hit him. The smug expression that had adorned his face earlier was now replaced with one of genuine unease. He shifted from foot to foot, unsure of what to say, but knowing, deep down, that he had to take responsibility for what had just transpired. Max turned toward him, fixing him with a stern but measured gaze. "Arthur," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "I think you owe me an apology. Not because of my job, but because of the way you treated me simply because of what I wore on my head." Arthur swallowed hard. He had never been in this kind of situation before, confronted with the very person he had tried to dismiss. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come immediately. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him, both the officers and the few bystanders who had gathered near the entrance of the cafe, on him. I'm sorry," Arthur mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to treat you like that. I just..." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I was wrong. I judged you without knowing anything about you." Max didn't let the apology slide easily. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "But next time, before you make assumptions, before you decide who belongs here and who doesn't, take a moment. Look at the person, not the symbol. And most importantly, make sure you know who you're talking to, because you never know when someone might just turn out to be someone with real authority." Arthur nodded, his face reddening with shame. He wanted to disappear, to hide from the weight of his own actions. But it was too late. The truth had come out, and he couldn't erase what he had done. Max glanced at the two officers one last time, then turned his attention back to Arthur. "Consider this a lesson, not just for you, but for everyone. People aren't what they wear. They're what they do, and I'd like to think we can all do better." With that, Max turned and started walking toward his car. The officers lingered a moment longer, seemingly unsure of what to do next, but eventually followed suit. The cafe, still silent and tense, seemed to exhale as if relieved by the resolution. Max didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had made his point, and for him, that was enough. But as he got into his car and drove off, Max felt a quiet sense of victory, not for the public confrontation, not for the apology, but for the subtle shift he had managed to create. One person, one lesson at a time. That was how change happened. A few days had passed since the dramatic events at the cafe. For Max, life had returned to its usual rhythm of managing the city's law enforcement. But the memory of that day lingered. He hadn't planned to return to the cafe so soon, but something in him wanted closure. So, on a sunny morning, he decided to stop by again, this time without any expectations. As Max pushed open the cafe door, a wave of familiarity washed over him. The decor was the same. The warm smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, and the morning buzz of conversation filled the room. But something was distinctly different. The tension that had hung heavy in the air during his last visit was gone, replaced by an openness he hadn't felt before. He took a slow look around. The first thing he noticed was the absence of Arthur. The smug, defiant waiter who had caused so much trouble was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a young woman with a bright smile and an approachable demeanor was working behind the counter. She seemed genuinely happy to be there, greeting customers warmly and making small talk as she prepared their orders. Max walked further in, and as he did, he caught the eyes of a few patrons. This time, there were no whispers, no judgmental glances. Instead, people nodded at him respectfully, some even offering small, friendly smiles. Word had clearly gotten out about what had happened, and who he was. He made his way to an empty table near the window and sat down. The seat was comfortable, the light streaming in from outside, casting a warm glow over the space. Max leaned back in his chair, observing the subtle but noticeable change in atmosphere. It wasn't just the absence of hostility, it was the presence of something better. Understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. As he glanced around, his eyes landed on a familiar face. At a table a few feet away, partially hidden in the corner, sat the same man who had called the police on him. The man was hunched over his coffee, avoiding eye contact, his posture small and unassuming. He looked like a shadow of the indignant figure who had shouted across the cafe days earlier. His once confident arrogance had been replaced with a quiet humility, as though the events of that day had left him with a lot to think about. Max didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The man's very presence, subdued and reflective, was enough of a statement. Max turned his attention back to the menu, though he already knew what he wanted. The new waitress approached his table with a cheerful smile, a notepad in hand. "Good morning! What can I get for you today?" she asked brightly. Max returned her smile. "Just a coffee, please. Black, and..." He paused for a moment, his tone turning playful. "If possible, I'd prefer it without any political questions attached." The waitress laughed lightly, catching on to the humor in his comment. "You've got it, sir. One black coffee, no politics." She gave him a quick nod before heading back to the counter. Max watched her go, feeling a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about the coffee, it was about what the moment represented. Progress, change, a small victory in a much larger battle. As he waited, he noticed other patrons occasionally glancing his way. Some whispered quietly to one another, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. It was clear that Max's story had made its way through the town. People now knew about the chief of police who had stood up to prejudice, who had calmly but firmly asserted his rights, and who had reminded everyone that justice was more than just a word. The coffee arrived quickly, steaming and rich. Max took a sip, savoring the warmth and the simplicity of the moment. He didn't need a grand gesture or a public apology from anyone in the cafe. What he had was enough. The air felt lighter, the people friendlier, and the lesson he had delivered seemed to have taken root. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the cafe spread throughout the town. It became more than just a tale about a man in a MAGA hat. It became a lesson about judgment, assumptions, and the importance of treating everyone with respect. Max's calm but decisive actions had turned what could have been just another moment of discrimination into a powerful example of justice and integrity. For Max, the victory wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about showing people that fairness mattered, that the law was there to protect everyone, and that no one should be judged solely by what they wear or believe. It was a reminder that beneath the surface, we're all more alike than we are different. As he finished his coffee and stood to leave, Max glanced one last time at the man in the corner. Their eyes met briefly, and the man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Max returned it, then turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. Justice had prevailed, not with fanfare or spectacle, but with quiet, unshakable resolve. And for Max, that was enough.